Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar on data governance demystified, how to maximize ROI from your governance efforts. I'm Marius Moscovici. I'm CEO and founder of Metric Insights. We are a leading enterprise BI portal that provides governance and boosts usage across all of your BI assets, everything from traditional BI tools, data science assets, and everything to Excel. And today I am happy to be joined by Anthony Algmin. And Anthony is a data leadership advocate. He's the founder of Algmin. He's the founder of the Algmin Data Leadership and the host of Data Leadership Lessons podcast. It's a great podcast. If you guys haven't checked it out, definitely take a look at it. He has great episodes every week with various thought leaders from around the industry. And he has decades of experience in data, including acting roles as a chief data officer. He was a data architect and a consultant. So he's seen sort of the industry and from many different perspectives. And you'll find, I think, that he has a really unique and fresh view on data governance. And he, in fact, wrote and published the very first book on data leadership. And he's really popular speaker. You've probably heard him if you've gone to various data events. He speaks in many events all around the world, including Dataversity. So before I pass this to Anthony, just from a few housekeeping notes, all the lines are muted. So please put your questions, if you have any, in the Q&A box, and we'll pick them up during the Q&A portion of the webinar. And with that, Anthony, the floor is yours.
All right, Marius, thank you so much for having me on this. I'm very excited about this talk today. And let's just jump right into it. So at any talk, I like to give the kind of Cliff's Notes version. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today on this webinar. So the Cliff's Notes version. So the first thing I have to say is that we've called this webinar, Data Governance Demystified. And I want to be honest, we're going to talk about data governance. We'll get to that. But the demystification part of this really comes back to understanding some of the building blocks that sit underneath data governance, like some of these big questions. Why are we doing data governance in the first place? What are we really trying to accomplish when we do data governance? Because if we can understand those things, then data governance will become much clearer. So we're going to be sitting here, and for the next several minutes, we're going to be talking about things that are not data governance. And when we do, understand we're building to something here. Okay, so the first thing, if you don't remember anything else after this talk, remember these three things, right? So data value is driven by change. And we'll talk about what we mean by that. But really, we have to understand that data value, data assets, they are different than the value we get from other kinds of assets. And so we're going to break that down and understand why that is, and why this notion of value from data, though we know we can do it, it seems to always elude us, or often elude us when we're trying to make something happen with this data that we know intrinsically is going to be valuable in some way. The second thing is that data quality requires intention. Now, that may seem totally random. It may seem like, what are we even talking about? Why do we go to this? We'll explain. But what we need to understand about data quality is that it is an inseparable. It is absolutely necessary to understand data quality to be effective in data governance. Because if we are not governing assets in a way that are exposing data quality characteristics, there is no way we're going to actually be able to drive this notion of return on investment, or this data value proposition. Okay, so bear with me. Data quality going to be an important piece of the data governance equation. You may think in your own organizations, if data quality is not front and center in your data governance organization, you're definitely going to want to stick around and understand that through the rest of this talk. Now, finally, data governance is a tool, not an objective. People focus on the success of data governance, and you should not care about the success of data governance. What you should care about is the success you have in extracting the value from data. May feel like a subtle difference, but it means all the difference in the world, because data governance is a tool. It's like an artist wanting to maximize the value of paintbrushes. You don't do that. What you care about is the outcome, the work of art, not the paintbrushes. So understand that governance to us as data professionals, as data practitioners, as leaders in our organization, our paintbrushes are things like data governance. And so we will optimize for the best art, the best outcome, not just the best tools. But we have to recognize that data governance is a tool, not ultimately the objective at hand. Okay, so with that, let's start diving into some of the details. Data is an asset, a weird one. So let's talk about data. Let's talk about data assets. And I think it's fascinating to think about data as an asset because we love to use, I love analogies. They say, analogies are the tools of the lazy or the unintelligent. I'll take that. That's fine. I love analogies all the time. So what I want us to do is understand that when we talk about data as an asset, that it's a little bit different than assets. It's not like, oil, you burn it up and it makes things move, and that's great. Data as an asset is a fascinating thing because data is abundant. With like any organizations out there not have enough data right now. No, we all have too much data. We have more data than we know what to do with, right? But when we use it, we don't use it up like we would like oil or other assets. We create more. When we use data, we actually create more data. What other asset does that, right? What other asset do you get more of and more enrichment of by using it? It's a weird asset, right? And it doesn't get used up. It degrades over time, or it gets sometimes lost, or it sometimes gets kind of mixed up with other things, but it doesn't go away. It doesn't disappear. And so I know Doug Laney has a bunch of terms that explore that. If you're interested in this notion of the economics of data, Doug Laney has recently written a book that I think is fantastic. So look that up. He's the infonomics author. He breaks this down in much more detail. But I want to at least introduce this concept if it's new to you. Understand that this data stuff needs a little bit of a different perspective than what we would typically have when we think about assets. And so understand data, abundant. We create more of it the more we use. That's fascinating. It doesn't go away when we use it at all. And we should note, though, and the last point is that data actually degrades over time. And so the longer it's been since that data has been created, the more likely we have either lost some of the fidelity behind it. Maybe it's gotten copied from place to place, and it may be not as true to what it originally was. This especially can happen sometimes, like in the financial markets with currencies and stuff. You move it from place to place. You may lose some decimals of precision because things get cut off. That kind of thing can happen with data, sure. But it also is, the longer it's been since the data was captured, probably the less useful it is to drive something of value. Remember what we said in the very beginning. Value is going to come here from change. And that change is going to be driven by the insights that we get from data and the actions and decisions we take as a result of those insights. So if we're looking at data that was 20 years ago, stands to reason that may not be as relevant or useful in driving change as data from a year ago or data from yesterday. Okay. All right. So understand the concept there. Now let's think about data costs. So one of the key parts of any value equation is going to be, well, what are the costs? What are the things that we have to invest or pieces of that value proposition that will take away in terms of what we're going to do with it before we expand based on the results that we get from it. So thinking about data costs, we have storage, right? So it does take money to store data. Our databases, data warehouses, data lakes, you name it. Transmission, so moving it, computing with it, changing it, evolving it, that can have a technical cost, that can have a human and process cost, that can have an opportunity cost. But as we move things with data or consume data, create reports or dashboards or interactive mechanisms of any kind to try to take those data assets and ultimately drive change from them, we're going to have a cost with that. The complexity cost of data, which I think in many ways is what data governance often is trying to solve, is one of the data costs that is it's very difficult to measure because it kind of happens nebulously and it's all over the place, but it leads to confusion. Confusion often leads to inaction, or it can lead to incorrect actions. So the complexity of data, if we interpret data wrong due to that complexity, we can actually be causing ourselves inefficiencies at best, but actually negative value in the end at worst. And we're going to break down the components of data value next, but we have to understand from a cost perspective, if we're going to make any investment, this is true of anything you're going to do and choose to do in your business. If you are going to make an investment in something, there's going to be an investment, a cost associated with that. The last one in the context of data that we should talk about is this risk of use. So what happens here is that if we're going to use data, which presumably if we're going to try to drive something of value, we're using data to do it, there's a chance that we misuse it and miss it or misinterpret it. We somehow take an inappropriate action based on the insights that we've gleaned from it. Or we could do all of those things and still not end up with a positive result. And we're going to talk about that a little bit next. But recognize, and this becomes kind of a theme too, is that just because we'd like our data governance efforts or our data value proposition or anything that we do in our business to lead to good things, think about all those businesses that have existed and no longer exist, because even though they tried and intended to be successful businesses, something didn't work and they no longer are. So similarly, we try to do things with data. There's no guarantee that those things will ultimately be beneficial at all, or certainly no guarantee that they'll be more beneficial than the costs that we incurred in using it. And that's a piece that I want you to think about for a moment too, is that data governance often doesn't really spend enough time, at least in most of the organizations that I've seen, we don't spend enough time with data governance in understanding these costs, understanding what are the things that we have been doing and what is that bar that we need to exceed, especially if we're talking about fancy terms like return on investment. If we are trying to exceed that with a 4x or 5x or 10x return on investment of the costs, we better know what those costs are, and B, have a value proposition that will justify that. Okay, so let's move on and let's understand when I keep talking about this data value, and this is core to data leadership. This is something that I've talked exhaustively about, written exhaustively about, focus a lot of my energies on every day, because this is at the most core piece of everything that we do with data, or really with technology, or most business processes, if we really think broadly about this. So the definition of the value of data: the business outcomes you achieve with X being an activity or decision, the business outcomes you achieve with X versus the outcomes you achieve without X, which means there is a thing that was going to happen if you didn't take this data, analyze it, use it, and try to come up with a better course of action than what would have happened anyway. The actual value of your data and the value of your effort in doing that is that difference between what ends up happening and what would have happened otherwise. And there's some interesting things about that that we would want to think about, right? Whereas in the end, if we do one activity, we probably can't measure the other, but we can start to estimate and understand. So the notion of value of data is actually conceptual. It's a concept that can't actually be measured perfectly, because both events can't occur at the same time under most circumstances. You can, in some cases, do some A/B testing or what have you, and get a reasonable understanding of what one would be versus what another would be. But a lot of the time, you get to make one call, you get to make one action or decision, and that's going to be the thing that you can measure in great detail. But then you're going to have to infer what the other would have been. So recognize that that's the value of data. It's all about this differential. It's all about the change that you make as a result of leveraging data. And that can manifest in a bunch of different ways. But the good part here, because I feel like I'm a bearer of a lot of bad news so far, but the good part here is that the measures, the way we actually measure this conceptually is actually pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. The way we measure data value is we look and estimate what would the outcomes have been and what are the impacts to the revenue. So what are the top line impacts? What are the things that made more business, made new sales, made new customers, got whatever positive end benefit that we've received, less the cost? Or was there an impact to our cost? Did we reduce something in our operational efficiency, or did we reduce some costs as part of our operational efficiency so that we did the same thing? We didn't change the top line, but we actually did something more efficiently and saved costs in delivering on that. That's a great way to add value. And then the last one merits a little bit of additional explanation, because you can't just say did we improve our risk management? Yeah, I like to use an insurance analogy. If we do something with data to protect ourselves in case a bad event would occur, we can't just say, well, if that bad event didn't occur, then we shouldn't have done it. Like that starts to break down. It's like the idea of like, if your house doesn't burn down, was that homeowner's insurance a good idea or a bad idea? Like, you can't just base it on the sample size of one. You have to look at it. Okay, was this a valuable risk protection? Because the number of actual events won't even be measurable. So in that case, you probably can't even measure either side of that equation completely, because you're only going to actually have a binary outcome of, did my house burn down or not? You have to look at whether or not the insurance was an appropriate measure. So conceptually relatively straightforward. And as we saw with the risk management one, in practice, this isn't easy. It's not easy to measure the value of data. But just because it's not easy doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We still absolutely need to do this, or estimate it, understand it, try to get better at it, build that competency in evaluating your options so that you can start to orient your efforts in a way that maximizes data value. And the reason is, this is what data leadership is all about. So if we think about that value of data and you understand that conceptually, there's many ways you can dig into much greater detail around what that data value is consisting of. The core to this, and what will ultimately be core to data governance, is that data leadership, everything with data leadership seeks to maximize data value, right? So data value is the thing that is the objective, right? The business outcomes related to the change of behavior or decisions that we have based on the data assets that we're working with, right? That sounds like something worth optimizing, right? Those are the actual business outcomes. It's not data governance. Data governance is a tool. Data value is real. Its impacts to your business. This is what makes fundamentally a successful business, not just a successful data enterprise, right? So data leadership seeks to maximize data value. That's us saying, hey, we want data value. We all agree, data value, let's get as much of that as we can. But like I was talking about before, we don't get to just decide that. We don't get to just say, hey, let's get all the data value. Doesn't work that way. We actually have to say, how do we orchestrate a series of activities and decisions related to the data assets that we have, the change that we can make to maximize the business impact that we get from those activities and decisions? That's data leadership. That's leadership, right? That's leadership related to data, right? So change is where data value comes from. I hope we understand that at this point, is that if we think about that core definition of data value, it's all about that change. It's all about that differential between what would have happened and what happens because we used data, right? That's what we want. So change is where data value comes from. Intending to create data values, no guarantee. We've covered that already. As I was talking before, we went live with Marius. I'm like, I love to steal my own thunder by saying things that then come up on the slides. There you go. Intending to create data value is no guarantee. We have to actually execute on that, not just wish for that, right? So the opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative. So I wanted to put that in there into this slide, because opportunity cost is one of those terms that it's kind of the opposite of a lot of data management terms. Opportunity cost is a term that just is straight confusing to a lot of people a lot of the time. It's really hard to get your head around until you study a little bit of economics. In this context, understanding opportunity costs really isn't that hard, but it's worth studying a little bit more. Wanted to put it in here, check that out a little bit more. But the key to it is just understanding you have what you are doing. This is ideally your best answer. So this is that choice, right? That if you're looking at data, you end up with all these different choices and all these activities you could take. You pick one. You pick the one that you think, yep, that's going to maximize the data value. What you have to understand is the opportunity cost is, okay, what was the next best one? What is that one that we really should have done? If we didn't have this, we would have done that one. It's important to understand that, because sometimes we have different parameters that we may need to consider, and understanding the concept of opportunity cost will help us understand how to navigate those. And so this is where being strategic and choosing actions comes from, is that recognizing, hey, I might have a handful, say I have 5 different things that I could do based on this data. They're all pretty close, One costs twice as much. One has a 80% chance of failure, but 20% chance of going gangbusters. And that might have the highest net present value. That's another economic term, but that's basically just saying it's going to have the highest predicted ROI. And that is not necessarily what you would want to do, because maybe it means you may bankrupt your company in 4 out of 5 of those occurrences, and 1 out of them you'll be on the cover of Fortune. Great. But that may not be the risk profile you're seeking in your business. So you may have to mitigate that and understand, hey, not everything is practically acceptable, even though theoretically you may want to understand the maximum potential, the maximum likely potential. So understand the notion of opportunity cost, and will help you navigate the decision-making process that you need to have when you're considering your data leadership strategy, or even just your data governance strategy, as you're figuring out, and this is why this ties to data governance. I'll steal a little bit of my future slide thunder as well. It ties to data governance because when we are thinking about the data governance activities and decisions that we're driving, when we're thinking about data stewardship, or we want to go do some metadata management, or we want to go, create this, data catalog somewhere, all of those have resources that are going to need to be invested. I would imagine that not a single person watching this webinar has all of the resources they could consume to further their data governance initiatives. Put another way, we never have enough resources for data governance. We have a very limited set of resources for data governance under most circumstances. So we need to understand the concept of opportunity cost in the context of data governance, because we need to make those choices. We need to understand those opportunity costs. We need to understand that value proposition. We understand what that risk profile is of our business, so we can make the right call and maximize the value created from those data governance efforts. It's all the same thing. And then as you start to understand how these patterns actually play out, you can see this working everywhere in everything you do. It's really at the heart of what we do in our careers, in our jobs, day to day, every meeting. We think data value, we see business opportunity, we see business results, business impacts. That's everything that we're doing, all of us. Whether we're in data or we're not, it all tracks back to what is the differential and business impact that we're making. That's key, right? So maximize data value and think broadly, expand that to any context it actually plays. Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about data quality. So we mentioned this in kind of the introduction. Data quality is probably not what you think, right? So what I want you to understand, and data quality, I talked a little bit about opportunity costs and how it's kind of a intimidating term that you just kind of don't feel like you understand, even when you do understand it sometimes. Data quality is the opposite. Data quality is one of those terms where it's like, I know what that means. It means, is the data good or bad? Like, how hard is this? This is easy stuff. No, that's not it at all. And it's terrible, because we do this all over data. We do this everywhere in the data world. It's like we choose these terms that are either super complicated, like metadata management, which is basically just a fancy way of saying context, or we do these things like data quality, which actually are much more nuanced, much more important to understand that nuance to do data quality. And we just confuse everybody. So data quality is probably not what you think. And because that, what you need to understand with data quality is that it's not, is the data good or is the data bad? It's data. It's ones and zeros at the end of the day. It's not good or bad. What we care about with data quality, and why we say data quality and why we think about data quality, is that we need to know whether or not data can be used for something, right? We're talking about doing change. Data quality is whether or not that data can actually support the change that we're trying to do, right? So data quality completely relies on circumstances. It's all about, is this suitable for use? Is this going to be able to drive the optimal outcomes for the things I want to drive? And so we need to understand what that is. And depending on what those actions or decisions or changes are, we need data of different quality. Like if we're going to run an ad campaign and we need to know basic understanding of customers, it's a little bit different than what our accounting group needs to balance the books. The need for data quality in those circumstances is wildly different. They're both valuable exercises. They're both valuable uses of data, but one requires a higher level of data quality. that's what data quality is really about. It's about, is the data that we are working with sufficient to drive the activities that we want to drive with it? If it is, then great, we can do those activities. If it's not, then we can't. It's insufficient. And so then we have a choice. Do we not do the activity? Do we do the activity with a limited degree of success because of the insufficient data, or do we improve the data? Like, now we have actions that we can take. And you know what we can do is we can use that same methodology around data value, assessing the data value to determine, hey, would it be worth the effort to make this data better so that we drive this activity that we think is going to add real value to our business? Maybe, maybe not. Is it worth it compared to the other options we have with these finite resources we were talking about? Maybe, maybe not. So we have to understand, for data quality to make sense in an organization, we have to understand, what is the data? What is it suitable for? And is what we're doing something it's suitable for, right? Data quality management explores all of that and assigns resources to improving data, or otherwise sourcing different data or capturing data. A friend of mine, Tom Redman, beat into my head over the years is the most important thing with data quality is capturing the data at the time of creation. Getting that right will make a bigger impact on your data quality than anything else. And I always appreciate that advice, because think about where you can impact data quality through a data quality management function. That's it. That's the number one way, capture it better. So start there and then look at how you might do that. Now, the one thing I also want to mention with data quality is the fact that when we have limited resources to improve data quality, we have limited resources to even evaluate the data quality. What's one thing that you rarely see that's kind of central to all of this conversation? Well, if we need to know to use data, whether or not the data is suitable for the use we have in mind, what does that imply? That implies we need to have some sort of an assessment of what that data quality is. And really, anytime we share data and anytime somebody uses data, they should have some sort of analysis of, hey, what's this data good for? What is the data quality? That's what it's all about. That's what we should be really thinking about. Because if I'm going to use data and I have no idea what the data quality is, what happens? Well, I use it anyway because I just assume it's good, right? Well, if I'm going to assume that and just use it, how in the world am I going to be able to assess potential data value and choose from the various opportunity costs that I have? Right? I guess it now. And we expect data governance to be successful if we don't even do something as straightforward as explain the quality of data so that somebody knows whether or not they can use it for an intended purpose. To me, that may be the most important function of data governance, and it is rarely done. And that's where I think logically, if we break down this challenge logically, getting data quality right and starting to be better about how we are communicating the suitability for use of any particular set of data, crucial to our success with data. Again, don't care if it's crucial to our success with data governance, because data governance is not the point. The point is data value. The point is business success. Data quality, definitely a spot on that road. So we want to be thinking about that. And that's why it all ties in with this notion of optimizing data governance and making sure that when we think about maximizing this return on investment of data governance, data quality is sitting right underneath that surface. Can you think of a more important function than data quality for data governance? I don't think so. Right. So there's some things, maybe like some compliance and that stuff still relies on data quality, though. Still relies on data quality. Okay. So let's talk more specifically about the value of data governance. Half hour in, and slide 9 of 11, we're finally got a slide that says data governance on it. So the value of data governance, like we've been talking about, is that data governance, it's a means to an end, right? This is a collection of activities. Like I'm interested in this notion of data governance, because how can you explain data governance without using some other data management function? So if I say, I'm going to go do some data governance, does that mean anything? It could mean I'm going to go populate a data catalog. Could mean I'm going to assign some data stewards or data owners. Could mean I'm going to create a business glossary, or could mean I'm going to do some metadata management. What is data governance as a function by itself? I don't know. Have a meeting, talk about data. We're doing data governance right now, everybody. That's great. Doesn't help anything, but that's my point here. It's the value of data governance is actually exposed only through other activities that have more detailed functions associated with it. Data governance is a collection. It's not an object, if you want to think about it in programming terms. And that's an interesting thought, because there's a lot of things that you will associate with data governance. But if you try to go in the reverse order and say, let's do data governance, let's have a data governance organization, what does that mean unless you understand what are the functions that you're expecting that data governance organization to perform? So let's go through some of the bullet points. Governance is means to an end, right? Got it. Here to maximize data value. We're going to coordinate these actions. We're going to direct the actions. We're going to direct the energies. We're going to try to create data value. Okay, we're going to choose those activities and decisions that come from data. We're going to try to measure it. We're going to try to understand that differential. That's what data governance is about. Cool, we agree. We don't seek to govern data so much as influence behavior. So that's the other thing that tickles me about this whole data governance thing. So we're not governing data at all. We're governing people and how they relate to data, how they use data, how they work with data. Data is just data. Like, again, it's ones and zeros. Governing data is not going to get us anywhere. Governing people, and again, I don't know that I like the term, but it's influencing people's behavior when it comes to maximizing the value exposed from the data assets. Not quite as succinct as saying data governance, but probably a little bit more accurate. So one thing, so if we're here, so if we can understand data governance is about influencing people's behaviors, okay, consider then, how do we do that? How do we ask people to change their behaviors or take actions to drive results that are meaningful to the business? And one of the things that I think is really important to think about, and again, we're here for a very short period of time. I've given full day classes on these topics. We're flying by these very quick. But I want you to think about anytime, this is true of any situation where asking somebody to do something, and in data governance, we tend to do this a lot. If we're going to ask somebody to do something, at the bare minimum, balance the empowerment and accountability. And what we mean by that is to say, if I'm going to ask you to do something, achieve some result, I've got to give you the ability to achieve that result, which sounds ridiculous. Like, I just heard the words out of my mouth too. And I'm like, yes, this is a absolutely ridiculous statement and absolutely true, and so often gotten wrong in so many contexts. We have to think, is what we are asking you to do actually possible for you to do? And if it is, great. Is it realistic for you to do is another question, but it's, how do we make sure that you are empowered to actually achieve the results that we're targeting for you to achieve? So that's key. The second piece of this, as we're thinking broadly about data governance, and this notion of like Robin Hood isn't real, sustainability of efforts needs balance too. This is what I'm talking about. So Robin Hood was notorious for stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. At least I think that was Robin Hood. Otherwise, the slide really doesn't make sense. But Robin Hood was that kind of person. He was trying to be a balancing force in the universe or something, I guess. But the reality is, and this is what happens with data governance too often, is we find ourselves going to the same knowledgeable people over and over again saying, hey, we need something else from you. We need you to be a data owner. Oh, we need you to define this thing, or we need you to explain this, or where did this come from, or how do you calculate this, or where does this go, or who should have access, or blah, 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 right? That's the same people. What do they get out of that? What is in it for them? You know, the WIFM, what is in it for them? What is going to come back to them in terms of benefit because of this help that they're giving? Too often data governance says, hey, please help us do these data governance things. Super important stuff. We don't have any quantification for that, but we know it's super important because data is valuable and all of this. Keep helping us so that somebody somewhere someday can use that data catalog that you've just spent 2 weeks populating. We don't have a definition of who that's going to be. We don't even know if that's actually going to happen. We think it's valuable because somebody decided it was, and we're hoping that somebody will use it someday, even though we're not going to tell them where it is because it's buried in SharePoint somewhere. What? So what we're saying here is find a way to get the people that do stand to benefit. Hey, I want to use data for something. I don't know whether or not it's suitable. let's do some assessment. Let's do some data quality analysis. Is this going to be suitable for what we want to do with it? That seems like a good use of data governance type resources. Let's go do that. Hey, I'm the person who's going to benefit because I'm going to be able to take this activity that's going to benefit the business. I have some interest in making this happen. Would it be possible then in the data governance ask to get that person involved? Involve the people who stand to benefit whenever you can. And if it's not direct, see if you can't find ways to connect some dots where we'd say, hey, if you could help us do this thing over here, we can help you do this thing over there. That creates a balanced incentive structure so that people are interested in helping because they're going to see some return on that. Just like the balance of empowerment and accountability, we need to recognize that if you're asking the same resources over and over again to put energy in and they're never getting anything back, then it's unsustainable. They're going to stop taking your calls or stop showing up at your meetings. You ever have that data governance council meeting where it started with a bang? You had 12 people at the first meeting. It was great. We're really excited. Then the next meeting comes and, well, only 11 people showed up this time. And well, 3 of them didn't do what they were supposed to do. But then the next meeting, well, only 6 people came and nobody really did anything. And you know what, maybe we should go to quarterly meetings. And then it just kind of fizzles away. And then 5 years from now, people will be like, you know what we should do is data governance. That's the kind of pattern we see all the time. It's because it's not rooted in anything valuable. And it's not created in any sustainable way. If we can understand some of these economic concepts that are kind of broadly applicable in many different contexts and organizations and apply them in understanding our own relationship with data and the people and the connections of how we're asking people to participate in data governance, then we will create momentum. We will actually create some sustainability in our data governance efforts. And that's what we're going for. Not just data value, but sustainable mechanisms to create ongoing data value opportunities as the business continues to evolve, as new opportunities for actions and decisions that can add value to the business materialize. We want to become experts in harnessing those opportunities, which can often just go by really quickly. And if we don't have a mechanism to seize those opportunities based on the way what the data could be telling us, again, that comes back to the very first thing we were talking about. Data will decay over time. The opportunities we have with the data we're getting right now may go away very quickly, and those don't return. So recognize that. The last couple of things I wanted to talk about on this slide is just understanding measuring that success. We talked a little bit about this earlier. Estimates are probably necessary. Like we said, under many circumstances, you can't measure both outcomes because only one outcome actually took place. So you have to estimate some here or there. And even then, when you think about things like what was the value of data governance to our organization, okay, so we can estimate the impact of what happened versus what would have happened, whichever way we went with various things or what we think the opportunity costs were. We can kind of assess that. What was data governance's role in that? Now you have another estimate, right? Like, was it 100%? No, it wasn't 100% responsible for this outcome. Was it 10%? Well, maybe it was between 10 and 20%. Okay, now we can think about, what is data governance's actual result and impact to the final result. You can debate that. Now, as we debate these things, and this is where like governance council meetings and but really any kind of meeting could go seriously awry, is when we're trying to kind of figure out where did these estimates come from, whether or not we agree with it, how can we even measure these kinds of things, what should we do next, what are these things? It leads to like, you expose one problem and then people all wanted like immediately try to solve that. That's what happens all the time. I'm sure all of you can think of a meeting where that's happened, where you raised a point that was like the first of 20 on the agenda and you never made it past the first point because everybody just immediately zeroed in on that and tried to solve it, and you ran out of time and you didn't get anywhere because nobody could solve that in that context. One technique that I find especially useful that I wanted to bring forward to you today too is understanding the notion of separating the debate of the equation from the debate of the variables. And I think this merits a little bit of additional explanation. So if you're in a meeting, understand whether or not this is a meeting to understand the information, understand what's going on, or if it's a meeting to make decisions. So in the context of data governance and this whole equation of the debate or the equation versus the variables, first agree, hey, there's going to be this impact. And this governance thing will have some amount of value, and will some percentage of that total impact will be attributable to data governance, and then the outcome will be whatever. And you sort of start to create a math equation with these things. I like to think of it as Mad Libs. I try to make it as fun as possible, but think of it as Mad Libs, where we're gonna fill in those details, those percentages. We're gonna do that later. But let's see if we can't come up with what is understanding the story. If we could figure out those numbers, which we may not be able to do because we're going to have to estimate them anyway. But if we could do that, what would the equation be? How would we measure this if we had perfect information about everything that happened and could break it down in finite detail? Okay, map that out. That's the debate of the equation. The debate of the variables is then going through Mad Lib style and say, okay, what is actually not Mad Lib style, because we actually need to know what the thing is. We can't just say, here's a noun and you put in a noun. No, it's actually saying, okay, was data governance 100% responsible or 0% responsible? Okay, not 100%. Was it 80%? Just kind of whittle down. Okay, it's between 30 and 60% responsible for the outcome that occurred. Fine. Now we have a range. Okay. And what we can do is go through the entire equation with all of those ranges, with all that variance. And we could actually say, well, we don't know exactly what the value of data governance was, but we know that it was somewhere between $1 million of impact and $100 billion of impact. How much did it cost us to do the data governance? It cost us $100,000. So we had a 10x return at minimum, and potentially an enormous return that I don't know how to do the math on the fly because I forgot the number that I said. So, but the key here is that if we need to understand how to maximize the ROI, like, we don't have to get to super detailed analysis. What we want to do is more than satisfy, based on the lowest range of estimates, or reasonable low range of estimates, that the data governance effort had been valuable. And so if we can think about that and ultimately the equation that we're going to want to solve, and we can decide on that up front, then we can backfill and work back towards understanding, what are these activities? What are those things that we need to do? Should we do some data quality here? Do we need to do some other activity to then give us the data assets at a sufficient level to go execute the decision or activity that needs to take place to hopefully result in business value? That ultimately becomes the value proposition for data governance. And that's how we maximize it through data leadership and make data governance more successful in your organizations. So with that, let's revisit. Remember, nothing else. Data value is driven by change. I hope that we've covered that successfully at this point, because if we didn't, I don't know how to. Data quality requires intention. Hopefully that makes a lot more sense now than it did 42 minutes ago. And then finally, data governance is a tool, not an objective. I think we hit that one pretty well also. So with that, for the remaining amount of time, we're going to open up for Q&A. Welcome Marius back. And I, again, appreciate everybody sticking around and paying attention to the presentation.
Thank you, Anthony. It was very, very thought-provoking presentation around, I think, some really unique ways to look at governance. And I'm curious, I think remind everyone, please put any questions you have in the Q&A, and we'll reference them. But I just wanted to kind of kick it off for you. I was wondering, this idea of data value and this idea of, as you described, kind of creating, understanding the actual values, create the potential value that data could create if better governance was being applied to it. Can you kind of give an example of that, something that you can think of in sort of your practice and situation where you've had to make that assessment, and how have you formulated that estimate? I think it'd be helpful for the audience to kind of just have a concrete example to latch onto.
Yeah, and I think that, I want to emphasize there's two kinds of value. There's this potential value, as you alluded to, where this is the maximum theoretical value contained in this data asset. If only we could extract it, right? And then there's the realized value, which is we've now done what we can, taken action or driven decisions with this information, and made it so that we could actually achieve a business result on top of that. And so, one of my favorite stories of when I was extremely successful in kind of building a business case around data value is back. It was when I was a chief data officer of the Chicago Transit Authority, or as I was a consultant, then became a chief data officer. And it was, we were struggling at the time with being able to actually just get at the fare system data, which is how we would know who and how many people rode the train and where did they board and like which stations or whatever, but like even basic numbers. of how many people rode the train or how many people rode the buses every day for a month was a query that we struggled to accomplish. It would take, many minutes, and it would fail all the time. And it was very difficult for us to even work with the data. And so my hypothesis that I was exploring, I'm like, we can't live this way. We can't do anything because this is standing in our way. And so what I did was I broke down, I'm like, okay, what is our challenge? Well, our current database architecture is not performant, and we don't know how to run queries against the system. We've got to find a way to achieve that. What would that take? So I broke down how could we get the data to a place where we would be able to then execute a query on it, and what would that open up? And so we looked at it, and it ended up being a very nominal amount of something like a $5,000 or $10,000 investment to be able to bring that data to a place where we could analyze it. And that would allow us to offset what took a single person an entire month to compile for a monthly report. And so there was a monthly report of like the kind of board level supervisor. It took them a month to actually compile the data for this monthly report. It was literally a person's job. And I'm like, okay, I know we're going to get a ton more value than this, but I can point to this. It's going to cost us $5,000, and we're going to save literally a head count from this. They're going to actually be able to do real work. That was enough to get it green light. So if we think about it from a data quality perspective, the people who were determining whether or not I could go and do it, where I was like, hey, let me do this thing, they were like overwhelmed with the idea that a $5,000 investment could make this person's life. And that was before you get all the icing on the cake, which was going to be, orders of magnitude more valuable. But that was enough, because all I needed to do was get a yes. I didn't need to explain everything. So in this case, I was able to then say, well, we're going to get way, way more than this, but this is enough for you to give me the yes. And at that point, I didn't have to do any more analysis. They were like, go do it. We did it. And then they got way more than that. And it ended up being half the cost anyway. But like, that's the kind of overwhelming aspect where you can just take a tiny little sliver and say, this is enough ROI by itself. Let's do it. And they saw that. That's how they make decisions. That's the other thing to understand, is that data governance has to play by the same rules as everybody else. When it comes to return on investment, when it comes to here's all of this project opportunities that we have as a business, why would we put our investment into the data governance? You have to be able to articulate, well, here's why. It's going to be extremely valuable, and we can at least quantify enough to make you choose this and let us do it. And then we'll blow you away once we actually get it done.
So this, I think you've touched on this, but let me sort of bring up the question that was brought up in the Q&A and see if there's anything else you want to add. Is, the question is about to say, hey, in order to have meaningful measurements, we get a benchmark first, right? Which makes sense, right? You need to know how much of an improvement you made, especially if you're justifying your governance initiative. So obviously generating those benchmarks, as you mentioned earlier, not a trivial exercise, especially for governance teams that are stretched very thin, as all are. So what are there any recommendations you have as to how to best convince business to spend resources on setting those benchmarks? Because oftentimes you need participation from the business to make that happen.
Yeah, and part of it comes back to just saying, if we don't have a map, we don't know how to get to where you want to go. We actually don't even know where we are. And so I like to draw in my simple mind analogy world. I like to think of, if I don't have a map, I need a map. And if you want me to go somewhere on that map, I need to understand the rules of how to get to it. And so that map I have to draw with enough detail to understand the path between here and where we want to be. And so first it starts with here. How do I draw and understand where I am? That's benchmarking, right? It's understanding, where are we today? And so if I'm asked from the business, hey, we need this thing, just build this thing, I'm going to say, well, what are you going to do differently if we build you this thing? Because our goal here is to maximize the change, the delta of impact that we have. And until I know what that is, until you know what that is, we don't know the right thing to do. And that's where we have to understand that opportunity cost. It's like, there's a bunch of things we could do. Why should we do this? And it takes the courage of leadership too, to recognize, hey, we don't want to make these decisions without a map either. We need to have an understanding of what are these choices that we have in front of us. We have limited resources. All of us have limited resources. So how do we deploy them in the best way possible? And if we can find that right kind of middle ground between all of our data topics and all of our concepts and terms, and what is fundamental to any investment of resources in your organization, we'll get on the same page, and then we'll be able to figure out, okay, what's a reasonable amount of benchmarking to drive that understanding of that action we should take. We can stop there to drive that action, and then let's go do it. And as we need to drive more actions, we may need a better map. And then we can invest more resources in drawing that better map as well.
That's a great answer. Another sort of question here, I think, was probably sparked by that great story you told about the Data Governance Council that sort of started off strong and then petered out, right? Do you have any kind of suggestions based on your experience, either specific recommendations, how to structure those governance councils, frequency of meetings, resources folks should use? Or how do you really make those things function in such a way that you don't have great initial momentum and then it sort of peters out?
Yeah, so I've seen two great recipes for failure that I think tells us what the answer should be. Both great recipes are kind of border conditions. So one is that example that I kind of used of like this top-down business-driven data governance approach of like, let's get some smart people in a room and talk about data and make all these decisions, and then we'll govern data and we'll be really happy. I've seen the other side, which is let's do it from a technology organization, which is very ingrained in the details, but then loses kind of that story and that relevance to the business. Again, you could consume almost infinite resources in either one and not make it to the other side. Like you just run out of juice. So I think the right approach is actually to do something that leverages technology amplification as much as possible to get scale where it's meaningful and impactful at a broad basis so that you can do that kind of prospecting of options, while also having enough senior top-down leadership to be able to fine-tune that understanding. So can you make a reasonable inference of what the actual governance would likely be, and then have people double check that that's correct? It's kind of the same notion of if I go into a meeting with a senior person in my organization, I probably don't want to just come in with a blank sheet of paper and ask them to tell me all the answers. What I want to do is start by saying, here's what I think these answers might be. Tell me where I'm wrong. And there's a lot more to react to. There's a lot more to adjust, and we get a lot more done faster because we came up with that. And so if we can do that with our technology, while we establish some top-down governance and meet in the middle, instead of saying, let's craft a policy and make everybody do it, that's going to be a lot harder to achieve than if we try to find that path from both ends first. It's like if we're digging a tunnel under a city, they start on both sides and try to meet in the middle. We kind of want to do that with our data governance effort as well.
That's good. Good insight. What's your sense of, this is a question here, and how do you scope areas to generate value? Right. I guess this is really, are you basing it on use case? You're basing it on domain level? What's the sort of hierarchy? What's the approach, that somebody should take to really go in and try to go after value?
Yeah, there's a few layers to that where you can think about it idealistically all you want to and say, well, if I could do anything, I would do this. And that's not an invaluable exercise. That's actually sometimes good to do that without constraint. But you also have to think about, okay, what is your reasonable sphere of influence? Because you could have all the ideas in the world, they have no ability to execute them whatsoever. So that's true at an individual level, that's true at an organizational level. So you have to overlay what is possible given your vantage point. So if you're doing this analysis and trying to come up with, hey, what's a reasonable thing for our data governance organization to focus on? Well, it needs to be something that you're capable of executing on. So think about those terms, and then think about what is meaningful to your business and what is your business good at? What plays along with your business strategy? So one thing we didn't talk about in this particular talk was alignment with business strategy. So business strategy shouldn't be created in a vacuum without understanding your ability to execute on technology, data, business process, any of those things. Like it's a wish list if it's not oriented with that. And similarly, your execution plan for data governance or data or technology or whatever shouldn't be done in isolation without reference to your business strategy. That business strategy has to unite a desire and an ambition with reality. And only if those meet do you actually achieve those measurable business results, those impactful results. I would actually argue that a lot of those businesses that we talked about during the webinar that have gone out of business had a poor alignment between their ambition and their ability to execute. Sears may have wanted to be a great web store e-commerce site, but didn't have an ability to execute on that. And that's caused them to lose what they did well and what they did have in terms of assets. And that got whittled away to the point where they couldn't recapitalize on that. And so those kinds of things are important from a strategic perspective. And this is a conversation that isn't just, hey, the data people, the people that are listening to this webinar, that's not just for us. This is a senior leadership challenge. We have to have our businesses rooted in reality, and we have to capitalize on actual opportunities, not just theoretical ones.
That's a great analogy. The Sears analogy is very impactful. We have a lot of questions, but we only have time for one more. I think it speaks to kind of how thought-provoking your presentation was, Anthony. But so let's just tackle this one for a moment. Do you think a waterfall approach or an agile approach should be taken to this? What have you seen sort of the best approach to tackling governance using the framework that you laid out for us here?
Yeah, I'm always an advocate for Agile as a proxy for nimbleness. And so I like Agile. I generally would ascribe to that. Now, that doesn't actually play in every context, especially because when you're talking about data governance, oftentimes you're getting off the ground with it being and I also do data governance part of your role. And so Agile works best when you have more fully committed teams. So you've got to watch out for that. It's also a recipe for potentially the tail wagging the dog or the cart leading the horse, whatever analogy you choose at that point. And it's easy to lose your way in Agile, just like it's easy to lose your way in Waterfall. So I actually don't care as much about the specifics of the management mechanism you choose to use. That's really dependent on the nature of your business, the people involved, what you're good at. What I think is more important is that you actually listen to the data. There's a concept out there that I've talked about here and there, which is this notion of instead of being data driven, people are actually trying to be data justified, and that they have an idea of what they want to do, and then they go and find data to justify that thing that they wanted to do anyway. They didn't just listen to the data and have that tell them. If you're trying to decide on what kind of project management or operational management approach you should take, listen to the data. Look at the data, measure something, use this as an opportunity to test drive in a little context, this notion of data value and understanding opportunity costs and all that. It can work the same way in that particular decision for what's right for your organization versus what's right for any other organization. So I would start with that and try to build that. The more you just do it, the more you try to understand it, the better off you'll be, because you won't have somebody, some consultant saying, hey, just do it this way. We know this, we have this proven approach. They haven't proven it at your organization. So go and just learn it, start doing it, learn from it. You know your organization better than anybody else does. And if you can learn some of these concepts and start to apply this with the concept of maximizing data value and understanding what really drives that, you'll start to be able to plug in data governance and data quality, and it'll fit within the fabric of everything else you're trying to do at work. Because this can't be done in isolation. This is your work. It's just a way to start managing and organizing and coordinating some of these activities in a way that maybe you haven't done before.
So Anthony, is when you talk about this agile approach, is the idea that then as you think about the things you're putting into sprints, are you using that data value paradigm to decide what goes in? Are you taking the things that have sort of maximal potential value relative to the value you're getting currently today? And then is that sort of the principle in play, or does it work differently?
Absolutely. Like if you have a prioritization of your backlog that doesn't understand what the value is, that's a good place to start assigning some value and debating that value. Remember, we were talking about the debating of the equation, figure out an equation and then debate the values, and then look at that. And if, and like in some cases you have some senior leadership that's driving your prioritization, that's fine, but work through it with them so you understand, hey, why is this valuable to the organization? How does this align with data or with the strategy of the organization? How does the data strategy need to execute on that strategy? And connect all those dots, because that becomes, it helps you then understand why the priorities are what they are. And then you can come to that next meeting, not with the blank sheet of paper, but with an understanding coming in the door of here's what we think it is. Help us understand where we're not right. And that'll help you maximize your data value in those engagements and in everything else that you're doing the rest of those sprints as well.
Well, thank you, Anthony. Thank you so much for sharing these great ideas. I think everyone has really, I'm sure, enjoyed this, and I want to encourage all of you, if you really, enjoyed this, to listen to the podcast. That go listen to the lots of great ideas that Anthony interviews guests and provides into that. So please go there, and thank you everyone for joining our webinar today.
Thank you so much.